He smiled as if he owned the courtroom, the billionaire, the titan, flanked by lawyers in $1,000 suits, and a mistress in a red dress who looked too young to know regret. But across the aisle sat the woman he was about to humiliate, the woman who gave him 2 children, 15 years, and her whole identity. She didn't flinch, because tucked inside an envelope on the judge's desk was a truth that would tear through Richard Langley's empire like fire through silk. And when it was opened, he'd lose more than just a case. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The media called it the divorce trial of the decade. Silicon Valley's golden son, Richard Langley, accused his wife of cheating, demanded a paternity test, and walked into court with a younger woman whose entire identity had been curated on Instagram. He thought the headlines would favor him, that public opinion would drown his wife in embarrassment. But something happened that morning, something even his legal team hadn't anticipated. A sealed envelope, a quiet attorney, a judge with no tolerance for theater. What made a man so powerful, so rehearsed, suddenly freeze in place? What kind of truth could make a courtroom fall silent in seconds? And why did Camille Langley, the woman everyone thought was broken, suddenly seem more dangerous than the man who built a billion-dollar empire from scratch? Those who sat in courtroom 7C that day say the air changed the moment her name was called. But no one, not even her closest friends, knew what she had brought with her that day, or what it would cost him. Before the envelope, before the silence, before the courtroom turned into a spectacle that would ripple across every major news outlet, there was only a man, a woman, and the story they once believed they were writing together. Richard Langley didn't start out with everything. He was born in Austin, Texas, to a middle school teacher and a father who fixed HVAC units. What he had, though, even as a boy, was a sense of inevitability, a conviction that the world would bend if he pushed hard enough. By 32, he'd built Langtech Solutions, an unassuming data security startup that 5 years later would be protecting the servers of 4 Fortune 100 companies. Money came fast, so did fame, and with it, a curated narrative. The genius husband, the elegant wife, and the perfect children. Camille Langley had met Richard in their final year at NYU. She was studying art history. He was building the bones of his first algorithm in his dorm room closet. Back then, he wasn't charming. He was intense, calculated, always staring ahead like the present was just an obstacle. But Camille brought something softer. She once said in an interview for a local charity that she fell in love with the way Richard looked at her like she was the only unsolvable mystery in his world. She married him a year later. They had their first child, Owen, within 2 years, and their daughter Bella arrived shortly after. She gave up the gallery she had just launched, stopped taking clients, and poured everything she had into their growing family. To the world, it looked effortless. But within the walls of their Lake Tahoe estate, Camille's life had begun to hollow. Richard was always gone. Meetings, conferences, board retreats. Camille started attending events alone, quiet, composed, smiling beside the other tech wives who knew the script by heart. And then came Isla Harper, blonde, 26. A PR intern with no last name anyone could pronounce until she wrapped it in designer silk and sat on Richard's arm like she'd always belonged there. Camille first saw them together at the Langtech Winter Gala, not holding hands, not kissing, just a look. A moment between two people who had crossed a line they wouldn't speak about yet, but one Camille recognized instantly. She didn't confront him. She didn't cry. Instead, she did something Richard would never expect. She paid attention. Every password he changed, every late-night call that went longer than 10 minutes, every bottle of wine charged to their Amex in hotels he wasn't supposed to be staying in. She waited, and she watched, until one night she noticed something odd. Isla was pregnant. The girl who had once said she wasn't the maternal type was suddenly posting quotes about motherhood and fate. Richard didn't deny it. In fact, he began telling people he would finally have a son who looked like him. That's when the real betrayal began. He filed for divorce within a month and demanded a paternity test for Owen and Bella. Camille didn't speak to the press. She didn't even tell her parents. She simply called a lawyer. Then she called a lab. And then she wrote a letter to the judge and attached 2 sealed envelopes, one with answers, the other with insurance. Because Richard Langley didn't just want out of the marriage, he wanted to erase her from his narrative. And Camille. She had no intention of letting that happen. Richard Langley was the kind of man headlines were built for. Brilliant, calculated, charismatic enough to command a room without ever raising his voice. By 40, he was a billionaire with his own line of fragrance, a charitable foundation, and a Forbes cover that called him the Data King. But long before the tailored suits and private jets, Richard had been a hungry coder with sleepless ambition and a $2 coffee habit. Camille met him during a lecture on the philosophy of aesthetics at NYU. He didn't belong there. He admitted he only came because the computer science building had lost power that day. But he stayed for her. She was luminous, quiet, but thoughtful. A gallery intern who believed in the power of stillness, in beauty that didn't need an audience. Their first date was pizza on a park bench. Their second was at a gallery opening where Richard had no idea what he was looking at, but watched her explain each piece like she'd painted it herself. Within 6 months, they moved in together. A year later, they were married. When Langtech took off, Camille was right there beside him. She handled press events, designed his company's early branding, and was known in the Valley as the art world's tech whisperer. But after Owen was born, she stepped back. Not because he asked her to, but because she believed in the life they were building. She traded curators for carpools, exhibit halls for preschool concerts. She folded herself into the quiet, unseen labor of raising a family, trusting that love, like art, didn't need to be loud to be lasting. But after Richard's IPO, something shifted. The man who once told her she was the compass for his chaos began disappearing into boardrooms and exotic strategy summits. He became a public figure, and Camille became his shadow. Their conversations grew short, his compliments mechanical, and then, during a company retreat in the Bahamas, a new name began circulating: Isla Munro. She was young, polished, and obsessed with influence. Her social media read like a catalogue of aspiration: rooftop brunches, filtered sunsets, and cryptic captions about rising from ashes. Officially, she was a PR assistant. Unofficially, she was always within 6 feet of Richard. Camille noticed. Of course she did. She noticed the change in his cologne, the way he flinched when his phone buzzed after 10 p.m., the new password on his MacBook. When a mutual friend casually mentioned seeing Richard and Isla dining at a private chef's table, at a hotel he'd claimed was booked for investors, Camille simply smiled. She didn't argue. She didn't rage. She just went quiet. Because Camille had learned something crucial. When Richard stopped seeing her, he stopped respecting her. And that made him sloppy. Camille once told that same friend, "I'm not afraid of him leaving. I'm afraid of what he thinks he can take with him when he goes." What Richard didn't know was that while he was preparing to rewrite his future, Camille had already begun documenting the past. Every receipt, every message, every account Isla had touched. Because she knew that the man she married, the man the world adored, was capable of anything, except humility. By the time Richard Langley stopped pretending, Camille already knew. The signs were no longer subtle, no longer whispers between intuition and doubt. He had become emotionally vacant. His affection, if any remained, rationed out like corporate memos. Conversations turned clinical. Dinner became silence served in porcelain. He began pulling away, not just physically but spiritually. He'd disappear to the office for late-night meetings that had no records, leave his phone face down during breakfast, and change his wardrobe to styles he used to mock. Camille noticed charges on the credit card, designer boutiques she never stepped foot in, restaurants she hadn't been invited to, and luxury gifts shipped to addresses she didn't recognize. She said nothing, not when she found a pale pink lipstick under the driver's seat of his car. Not when she saw a photo of Isla wearing the same limited edition bracelet Richard had once claimed was too tacky for Camille's taste. Not even when she found a folded note tucked into her art books. a note in Ila's handwriting, written on Camille's personal stationery. It read, "Thank you for keeping him warm while he waited for me." That was when something broke, but not Camille. Richard came home that night and told her he was moving out. No argument, no theatrics. Just an, "I think we both know this has run its course." Camille nodded. Watched him pack his leather duffel bag with the same hands that had once traced the outlines of her growing belly. Watched him kiss Owen and Bella on the forehead, telling them, "Daddy's got a new place, but nothing's changing." But something did change, everything. Because a week later, Camille received a call from her lawyer. Richard had filed for divorce. But that wasn't the betrayal. In the official filings, buried between statements of irreconcilable differences and a breakdown of shared assets, Richard had added emotion. He wanted a paternity test for both children. His claim? The children looked nothing like him. He suggested Camille had been unfaithful, that her silence was guilt, not grace. The media caught wind within days. Headlines painted Camille as the desperate ex-wife clinging to relevance, while Richard paraded Isla at charity events like a new accessory. Still, Camille said nothing. She dressed her children for school. She watered the houseplants he never noticed. She attended mediation sessions without missing a breath. And when her attorney handed her the court's notice of the paternity hearing, Camille did something no one expected. She smiled, not bitterly, not in anger, but with the calm of a woman who already knew the outcome. Because while Richard had been rewriting the narrative, Camille had been collecting proof, not just of her children's truth, but of his. On the day of the hearing, as Richard submitted his request for DNA testing, Camille stood and addressed the judge. She had no objections to the test. In fact, she insisted it be done. But she also asked that a second set of tests be submitted, sealed, verified, and notarized by an independent lab. Tests she had paid for, quietly, months earlier. The courtroom paused. Richard looked up for the first time in 20 minutes. His eyes narrowed, but Camille didn't look at him. She just handed her envelope to the clerk and returned to her seat. That moment, small as it was, changed everything. Because the truth wasn't a mystery. It was already in the room, resting on the bench beside her, waiting to be opened. The courtroom was just the stage, the real work. The meticulous unraveling of Richard Langley's carefully curated image began behind closed doors in silence, without press conferences or public statements. Camille Langley didn't fight back with insults. She fought back with evidence. A week after the paternity hearing was set, she retained a private genetic lab out of Seattle, reputable, discreet, and with no ties to Richard's vast network of influence. The tests were processed, triple verified, sealed under chain of custody. There would be no question of tampering. At the same time, her attorney, quietly but effectively, began pulling Richard's financial records. The findings were staggering. Over $1.2 million had been funneled into accounts tied to Isla Monroe. Not directly. That would have been too easy. But Camille's attorney traced the deposits through LLCs, fake consulting invoices, and offshore shells. All of it tied to image consulting, social media branding, and other euphemisms for the lifestyle Isla was enjoying on Richard's dime. A paper trail, dressed in couture. As this investigation deepened, the story broke. First, it was a blog post, gossip column-level speculation that Richard Langley's marriage had imploded and that his children might not be biologically his. Within hours, TMZ picked it up. Then it was the Post, then the Times. Overnight, Camille's quiet world was lit under a spotlight she never asked for. Paparazzi staked out her kids' school. Helicopters hovered over the estate she hadn't left in days. Friends stopped texting. Acquaintances stopped speaking. But Camille stayed silent. Not a single interview. Not even a statement from her legal team. Richard, on the other hand, had a strategy. His PR team launched a full-scale offensive. They painted Camille as unstable, a woman with documented emotional imbalances. They pushed anonymous leaks claiming she had once been institutionalized for postpartum depression. A lie easily disproven, but whispered just loudly enough to cause doubt. Talk show pundits debated whether she was a manipulative ex or simply overwhelmed. Some called her brave, Others called her calculated. Camille responded the only way she knew how, by focusing on what mattered: Owen and Bella. One night, in the middle of it all, Camille stood just outside her daughter's bedroom door and overheard a whisper she'd never forget. Bella, 7 years old, looked up at her older brother and asked, "Am I still Daddy's favorite, if he's not our real daddy?" The words hit her like a crash with no sound. That was the moment the war became something else. This wasn't about salvaging her dignity. It wasn't about revenge. This was about protecting her children from the kind of man who would rather erase them than admit to his own shame. Camille didn't cry. She kissed Bella goodnight. Then she went downstairs and opened the file her attorney had labeled Phase 2. It contained everything: receipts, deposits, Isla's travel logs, and most importantly, the sealed envelope with a second DNA report, the one no one outside the lab had seen. She stared at it for a long time, not because she feared what it might say, but because she already knew, and so did Richard. He just hadn't figured it out yet. The morning of the final hearing, the courtroom was already full before the clerk unlocked the doors. Spectators, press, bloggers, legal analysts, everyone wanted a front row seat to watch Richard Langley dismantle the woman he once called the heart of his empire. He arrived precisely at 9 a.m., as if to remind the room who ran on schedule. He was dressed in a perfectly pressed navy suit, a silver tie pin catching the morning light, flanked by a wall of celebrity attorneys, and at his side Isla Monroe, smiling, poised, clutching a designer handbag that likely cost more than Camille's entire wardrobe. They walked in like royalty, like conquerors, ready to take back what they believed had been stolen. But it wasn't a coronation, it was a reckoning. Camille entered 5 minutes later, alone, no entourage, no stylist, just a tailored navy blue dress, simple pearl earrings, and a small black folder clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had already read the ending. The judge wasted no time. He acknowledged both parties, outlined the motions, and then lifted the first envelope, the one Richard had insisted upon, the paternity test. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he read. Owen Langley, 99.99% probability of paternity. Bella Langley, 99.99% probability of paternity. Richard didn't move. Isla blinked once. The judge continued. The allegations of infidelity as grounds for divorce are unsupported by genetic evidence. Mrs. Langley's request to include independent test results is hereby granted. A second envelope was opened. The judge paused only briefly before reading the findings. Subject: fetus attributed to Ms. Isla Monroe. 0.00% probability of paternity attributed to Mr. Richard Langley. The silence that followed was not quiet. It was thunderous. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Isla's face turned pale, her hands trembling as she turned toward Richard. But he didn't look at her. He didn't touch her. He pulled his arm away slowly as if she were poison, something embarrassing that had just spilled onto his lap in public. The judge lifted his gavel, but didn't strike it yet. Instead, he looked directly at Richard and said, "This court does not exist to mediate your personal narratives, Mr. Langley. You have, however, attempted to damage reputations and defame character under the protection of this institution. As such, sanctions will be applied." He ruled in Camille's favor. Full custody, sole decision-making authority, spousal maintenance approved. And the court would be forwarding the false claims and financial inconsistencies found in discovery to the appropriate authorities. Camille nodded only once. She did not cry. She did not smile. She stood up, gathered her folder, and walked out, passing by Richard and Isla without so much as a glance. A single reporter outside whispered later that it was the quietest walk of victory they'd ever seen. But what echoed louder than any victory was the truth itself. He had wanted to erase his children. He ended up erasing his legacy. The headlines didn't fade overnight, but Camille Langley didn't wait for silence to start over. Within a month of the verdict, she quietly sold the Aspen estate, the one with 12 bedrooms and a wine cellar Richard never stepped into. She donated half the proceeds to a legal defense fund for single mothers, women who, like her, had been outnumbered in rooms designed to intimidate them into submission. She moved back to the city she once dreamed in, back to gallery walls and stretched canvas and soft lighting that told stories no courtroom transcript ever could. She reopened her art space under her maiden name, Camille Hartwell. Her first exhibit was titled, Unclaimed: The Cost of Being Invisible. Each piece was a reflection of memory, motherhood, and survival. It sold out before opening night. Isla Munro vanished. No press releases, no public statements. Her Instagram went dark. A few tabloids speculated she had moved to Europe. Others said she'd checked into a wellness center in Arizona. But the world had stopped caring. She was a headline with no arc, just a footnote to someone else's fall. Richard Langley's descent, on the other hand, was anything but quiet. Within weeks of the court ruling, Langtech's board of directors issued a statement expressing deep concern over recent personal matters that have affected the public's trust. Investors began pulling out, shareholders demanded transparency, stock prices tumbled, and when a group of minority investors filed an ethics complaint citing the misuse of corporate funds, Richard stepped down. Not because he wanted to, but because by then the empire he built had already begun to reject him. The video that changed everything was only 43 seconds long, a shaky clip shot on a phone by a reporter just outside the courthouse. It shows Camille walking hand in hand with her son, Owen. No security detail, no entourage, just her, the folder still tucked beneath her arm, and a calm that looked untouchable. As she approached the crowd, a journalist called out from behind the cameras, "Do you regret anything?" Camille paused, turned slightly, smiled, not bitterly but with a grace that held no apology. "Yes," she said, waiting this long to speak up. That moment went viral in under an hour. It was shared by mothers, artists, attorneys, and women who had waited too long to be believed. In the end, Camille didn't just survive the courtroom, she redefined the battlefield. Because sometimes power doesn't look like revenge. Sometimes it looks like walking away, knowing you didn't need to scream to be heard. You only needed to tell the truth and hand the right person the envelope. What would you have done if you were Camille? Would you have stood quietly while a man tried to rewrite your children's origin story? Would you have allowed humiliation to become your legacy? Or would you have done exactly what she did? Gathered your evidence, held your peace, and let the truth speak louder than the accusations. Camille Langley never raised her voice. She didn't run to the press. She didn't try to outshine Richard's spotlight. She simply waited for the right moment to switch off the power. In a world that often rewards the loudest liar, she proved that calm, calculated truth can still break through. And in doing so, she protected more than just her children's names. She protected their right to know who stood for them when the world tried to forget them. Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. Subscribe now. And if you thought this story was shocking, just wait until you hear about the wife who sued her husband's mistress and walked away owning his company.